So in part 3, we'll be talking about study characteristics and inclusion and exclusion criteria. For study characteristics, this is kind of a section that can be done in many different ways depending on the journal club. The way that I've found that works best for me is creating a who, what, when, where, why list. And what I mean by that is basically a summary of how they conducted the study itself. So just going down the list here, you see the first one that I've included here is data source. Now, data source kind of doesn't fit in the normal who, what, when, where, why list. And the reason being is that not every study actually really needs specification of where the data comes from. Now, there are situations where it's really important to know where did the data come from. And it is something that you should understand, but not necessarily include in the presentation. So for example, in situations where you absolutely need to know where the data came from is one, does the data come from the patient? Does the data come from the researchers themselves? Or does the data come from some public population health management database? And the reason why it's important to differentiate between these two is because if the researchers created the population health management database or some such database, there might be some parts of the database that maybe aren't as relevant. There might be some ambiguity with that database. Basically, it's just important to note, are they using some kind of fancy database that they get their information from that doesn't apply to my patients, or does it apply? And it's from, say, Medicare or Medicaid. It really depends on what type of study that you're reading. So for this study that I did, it was important to note where the data came from because it changed the perspective of the data. One of the pieces of data came from claims, kind of an encounters database. One came from the actual EHR, and one came from kind of a data mart database. And so it's important to differentiate that these different types of databases might collect different things about the patients. So we might be missing some kind of data depending on where they collected that data from. So this is definitely an optional part of the journal club. When looking at who, this is where you want to include your N equals value. So you want to include how many patients were actually included in the study. If there were patients that were excluded, you can talk about that in the inclusion and exclusion criteria portion. When is really important because you need to know when was the study actually conducted. So just think about this. Say you had this specific study about hypertension, and they collected the data from, say, 2014 to 2016. And then the study is not actually published until 2020. Well, we know that there's been a change in the ACC AHA guidelines since 2015. And so if we are looking at the data from this, random study, and we're finding, well, this doesn't really line up with practice, then we can kind of give the audience some context that, oh, this was conducted then when the guidelines were in this way. And so then we can, make some conclusions that, well, if they were following the guidelines then, it may not, apply to the guidelines now. And so that's why it's really important to know when the study was conducted. It's also important to note if there's a difference between when it was conducted and when it was published. For that same reason, just mention it to your audience. And then it's also important to know when was the follow-up finished, because sometimes a study will say, oh, we ended in 2018, but you find that they only collected data, say, for 5 years. Well, where are they getting the extra time in there? And a lot of times that extra time is the follow-up time. So it is important to note how long they followed the patients after the study was completed. Why can be interchangeable with objective. So you can say why or objective, it doesn't really matter. But this should be a 1 or 2 word sentence. It should not be really long because study characteristics is just meant to be kind of an overview of how they conducted the study. And then for how, I like to use the how section as an explanation of, was it retrospective? Was it observational? Was it comparative? And any of those variables. And then you can also kind of briefly list what kind of analyses they did. I will note, if you include some type of analyses on your presentation, you must be able to speak to it and speak of how it's done, not necessarily down to like the actual statistical formula, but you should understand what it shows. So if someone were to ask you, can you explain what Cox proportional hazards means? If you're not able to say, oh, well, it was used to compare these two medications by time to first incidence. If you can't state why, or if you can't explain why they use this or what they use the hazards to show, you should not include it. And similarly, if you're reading through your study and you're seeing an analysis that you don't understand, it's so imperative that you take the time to understand why it was used and what it means, because that's the easiest question for preceptors to ask you. I'll talk more about analysis section in a later mini lecture. And then talking about inclusion and exclusion criteria, I cannot stress enough, this is so important to any journal club. For absolutely any journal club, you need to understand who is included and who was not. And the reason why is this sets the stage for, does this apply to my patients or does it not? Did they include the right people in the study or did they not? For example, say we have a study, I'll use my previous study about hypertension because that was what this journal club was on. Say we have a journal club and they say everyone with hypertension was included. We can't stop there. We need to look at, okay, what did this study consider hypertension as? Was it 140/90? Was it 130/80? We need to know what their threshold was. Because if this study, picks some crazy number like 160/80, which I haven't seen used ever, but say, the study picked that, well, then that would kind of set off some red bells in our head. And we would think, well, that doesn't really apply because we know that hypertension is, measured at this level by this guideline. So you can kind of start to assess, did their protocol line up with normal practice? And if it doesn't, that's something that we can be critical of and we can mention in our discussion. Another example of why inclusion and exclusion criteria is so important is because, say, we're looking again at a study with hypertension and they excluded anyone on a beta blocker. Well, then again, we can have some red flags come up and think, this doesn't really make sense, because we know that while beta blockers might not be the best for hypertension, we know they have an effect on hypertension, whether they're cardio or cardioselective or not. And so it's really important that we kind of understand. So it's really important to understand who is and who's not in the study. One other thing that I want to add is that sometimes the inclusion and exclusion criteria can be a little bit confusing. Again, you should try to understand, is the inclusion and exclusion criteria relevant to the disease state and the medication? And if you can try to start to think like that, then your discussion will be that much easier.